Sound and data.
This is a recording for the Sound and Data channel. I'm just going to introduce Carla Scaletti, who, why don't you introduce yourself, actually? How would you describe yourself at this point?
I'm Carla Scaletti. I'm a composer, and I'm the designer of the Kima sound design environment, and co-founder of Symbolic Sound Corporation.
So you don't have an academic affiliation at all? Huh?
I don't.
You live in Champaign-Urbana, right, in that area?
Yes.
Yeah, so you're probably closely associated with things that go on at the University of Illinois there.
Well, I'm independent of the university, but I will be teaching a course in sound design next semester. I'm really excited about that.
Oh, cool. Well, anyway, I'm going to put the link to that keynote address, which I would urge anyone who's listening to this podcast to maybe pause it and watch that talk, because it was really one of the best. I mean, I give tons of these sonification talks all the time, but I really thought you dug a little bit deeper than I go. I mean, I didn't do Bruno Latour, which that was a wake up call to me to I had included him earlier on in some talks, but I liked the way you included his thinking relative to sonification.
Yeah, I had discovered him kind of recently, and yeah, he's got a lot of interesting observations about visualization.
Yes, but they go right across anytime you talk about these things. But I think the thing that's so strong about that talk was how well you identified the puzzle, which we keep running into. I just recently did an interview with Mark Ballora. Yeah, Mark Ballora, and he was saying he was no longer trying to make the killer sonification app.
What do you think about the gravitational waves, though? Don't you think that is the killer app? I mean, that got tremendous excitement around sonification. It generated a lot of excitement.
Okay, well, I want to differentiate. There's two things that, yes, it's great for generating excitement, and also he said the long-range plan is to get the next generation of users thinking in terms of expecting sound to be present as part of the descriptor of whatever thing is going on.
Right, and it's just getting to be easy to do that, technically.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's probably part of the mysterious equation. But what the nut we've been trying to crack is to try to do some sort of scalable app that would be like the equivalent of the Geiger counter or something. Like you mentioned that physicist in your talk that said he wanted to be taken seriously, so it was going to include sound in his presentation.
Right. There was this kind of, Alexandra Zupper had noticed this kind of ambivalence that the researchers had. Even the researchers who were using sonification or using sound in their public outreach somehow felt it was less serious, or it wasn't a legitimate tool for their research. And yeah, I think it is a legitimate tool for research, and it, as you put it, that's the nut to crack. Like, how do we? I think that the key is education, training in analytical and attentive listening.
Right, almost deep listening to Carla.
Yeah.
Late great associate Pauline Oliveros.
She was on the right track.
I think so. I mean, one thing that the listeners should know is that you credited with the first definition. Is that true? I mean, because the one you see on Wikipedia is attributed to Greg Kramer, but it seems to me your initial definition, which is much more succinct in my opinion, was from '92, which is like the 2 years before that, right?
Well, Alan Craig and I had done some work at NCSA, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. At that time, we called it data sonification, in part because we wanted to distinguish it. Since we were both musicians, we wanted to distinguish that activity from the work we did as musicians, in part to kind of make a parallel to data visualization.
Which was, at that point, also just sort of, SIGGRAPH was just kind of happening, right? But look, it took off. And all the software development that happened around visualization is, there are just mountains of it. And the tools are so much easier to use.
Well, we do have a very visually dominated culture.
Right.
Even our vocabulary, even in English, it's hard to come up with words for describing sound.
And I've even found audio display problematic in that it's the idea of using the word display, which seems to me to be a very visual word. We know
That's true. No, it's true. But you could argue that sonification goes way further back than the 90s.
You have the Arithmetic Field of Charles Dodge's piece, which is a very early version of a type of sonification, before it was called sonification.
Well, for me, I would call that music and not sonification.
Okay. Yeah, we should drill down on that a little bit, I think. Go ahead. What do you mean by that?
I think that data sonification is such a powerful tool that it deserves its own name.
It's a leg on the stool, as I remember.
Its own leg on the stool, yeah. And that it's a very powerful thing. It's probably been, it's starting to be utilized, especially by people in the ICAD community,
right.
but less so in the wider community so far. But I think it deserves its own name. And I think it's very different. The goals of sonification, of data sonification, are different than the goals of data-driven music, or as I prefer to call it, just music, because all music is data-driven.
No one is confused by Cage's use of Yarrow sticks between divination and music, So yeah, your point is well taken. And the funny thing is, I arrived myself at the sonification thing. I mean, it was in the air, but I was doing these like digital elevation model conversions simply in the same model of process that post-Cageian thinking. What are your earlier works where so you make this distinction between your work in sonification and your compositional work. So where's that gray area? When do you make that decision?
I think it's if the goal of the sonification is to understand the data, but more than just the data, it's understanding the dynamical process.
Right, yeah.
That produced that data. I mean, your focus is really on understanding or figuring out that process.
Looking for patterns and looking for scale and all that kind of stuff, yeah.
I mean, the sound itself almost doesn't matter. You almost want it to disappear. In the sense that I don't know if you've ever been working with researchers and they'll say, yeah, I'm looking at the data right now. And what they mean is that they're looking at a graph.
Right.
And, it's almost like we forget that, that graph is a mapping of the data to this two-dimensional flat picture.
Right. And yet, and you pointed out really strongly that it took a 10-page explanation when the first graphs showed up, right?
Yeah.
So that's really fascinating to me that we're in this era of maybe 20-page explanations.
Right.
Right. This burden of what music is culturally and the ever-presence and the post-Edison separation of the act of music to recording. And so now people have expectations when they hear sounds. And then Cage broke that boundary, or maybe even starting with Perez, the boundary between sound and music. So that this is a real interesting distinction, this thing of sonification having this informatic purpose as opposed to music, which has this other more ineffable purpose.
Yeah, I was really, really happy to discover Alexandra Zuper and all of her work. Well, she had just noticed that people, she called it the expectation of the auditory sublime. That people have an expectation, as soon as it's sound, they have this expectation that it's going to be a kind of this emotional, sublime experience. Whereas they don't have that expectation if they're going to be looking at a graph.
Right. But on the other side, there's been a lot of time for designers and visual thinkers, the Edward Tufts of the world, to spend a lot of time bringing, I guess, this sense of beauty or at least color balance to visualizations.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's nothing like a good design. It does give you a sense of pleasure, I guess, but it's still the point is still, I guess the measure of quality of the graph is how well it preserves the relationships in the original model. And I think that should be true for sonification also.
And I think it is, but there is this education or training problem that we've run into with our research, even trying to do serious sonification. I mean, let me explain something so I can frame the way I'm talking about this. We had a DARPA grant to do sonification of neuroscience data, but it included a stipulation that it needed to be performed.
Oh.
And it sort of got in that mix in the way of the development, because as the composers like Tim Perkis and Andrew Blanton and myself were working on it, it was always in the back of our mind, well, we got to make this so it'll sound good if we're in concert,
right.
you know? And it was actually a problem. If you can, I mean, that's why I perked up when you said that thing about music.
Yeah, that's an interesting stipulation. I mean, that kind of means whoever framed that grant thought it was public outreach rather than research.
So do you have these kinds of projects going at all?
From time to time. I mean, it's not a constant thing, but it's just every once in a while I will work with a researcher, or sometimes also just find some data by myself and just work on it by myself.
Just as kind of an exercise.
Yeah, just out of curiosity. Yeah.
I mean, is it ever at the core of pieces of music of yours?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
But I use, for me, the reason that I would use data in my music is for discovering some new structures that I might not come up with. If you know how sometimes you can fall into habits when you're composing. And I like to use data to kind of shake myself out of those habits. And
this is why David Koch developed that whole Emmy thing, was for him to be able to turn on his music intelligence thing to give him new ideas on his own music.
Yeah, it's like I'm a shaker or something, right? You just want to shake yourself out of those local minima or something.
Yeah, well, so when you are working with researchers, what's that context? I'm just sort of curious to understand your relationship to that.
See, I think that you, along the lines of what Latour was talking about, right. you would never have just one mapping.
Yes.
Yeah. So when you're working with a researcher, you're trying many, many, many different mappings and getting feedback and trying to tweak them and try a new mapping or try new data, try a new experiment, get data from some other people. And I think that's it's just a different process than when you're composing. You're using the data somewhat in the way like people used to use stochastic processes.
Yeah, right. I mean, in some ways, Xenakis can be thought of as sonifying mathematical statistics, you know.
Yeah.
He brought the Markovian walk to the fore, you know, with a bunch of his work in the early 60s.
As a way to find new structures for new music.
Yeah, he said, I mean, it was an amazing chance to work with him at one point back in 1980.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he said this thing where the computer just generates the stone, the musician has to be the sculptor.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah, it was a really great metaphor for what goes on. And that was actually very influential in my thinking relative to this, and it sounds like yours as well. Well, this is such a fascinatingly complicated area because it's like we're coming at it as composers, but now at least I have been tasked with trying to make something functional, that isn't. And so my take on it is to make the functional thing and then make music with whatever the result of that process is. Does that seem to be a reasonable way to go, or like your input?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable. It's probably, but I'm going to guess that the results that you get for working in the clinical problem, on the clinical problem, are going to be different than the results you get for your live performance.
Yes, definitely.
Because you have different criteria, I'm guessing,
for
the result.
What ended up happening was Andrew Blanton made like a drum interface and just like kind of hit the data and played it like a very complex kind of drum thing. And Tim Purkis made a processing thing that was completely unrelated in terms of the software with the visual model that we were working from. So it ended up that the performance just broke away from all of the sort of research aspect, which was a really interesting result. We're actually right in the middle of writing.
And it's pretty amazing how you can take the same data set and end up with these totally different results, like you described.
Okay, now this gets to the other thing that I'd really like to run by you, since you've had such critical thinking on this for so long. The tack we're taking now with Roger Molina and this Art Science Lab here is to try to make a standardized approach to the types of sonification. So sort of like trying to identify a taxonomy of sonification types, and then create what we're going with C sound just because it can be sort of universally distributed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that comma separated values or whatever could be just dropped right into place and immediately, not unlike the sandbox that Bruce Walker and that team at Georgia,
right,
but with much more sophistication and sort of with different techniques and stuff. Does that seem like something that would fit into your thinking about this?
Yeah, I think we probably will have to come up with some standardized ways of doing the mapping in order for it to become a tool, as you described.
Yeah, like everybody knows the Cartesian coordinate system.
Exactly, yeah.
We don't have a sound equivalent of that.
Right. And in some way you could say, well, that's not quite as interesting as leaving it wide open. But I think it's a necessity. In fact, like I had hoped that this was going to happen at the ICAD, was this idea that Meg Shadell had of adding sonifications to every entry in Wikipedia.
Right. Well, that, what is it, a hat note or something like that? There is a Wikipedia, a live Wikipedia stream that's happening. That's a sonification of Wikipedia edits.
Oh, the edits. Okay.
Yeah, I'll put that link, since we talked about it, I'll put that link up as part of what we discussed, because it's kind of interesting. It's again, though, and I don't know if you've seen Martin Curie's sonification critique that he did as a YouTube, because he makes a really compelling argument differentiating between what you're characterizing as music made with data from actual stuff. When I first put it on my Facebook thing, Doug Kahn came back with a real strong reaction to it. Okay. But I think he's talking about that same thing of this differentiation between music and functional sonification.
There's also the aspect of accessibility. If we could sonify any of the data in Wikipedia, if each of the graphs also had a sonic counterpart, which is technically possible now. Yeah, then it makes it so much more accessible for
this is where that standardization thing.
Yeah, I think that could it could be a de facto standard if something like Wikipedia could become the standard.
Well, it's always been, ICAD has always had that sort of, and also a lot of the funding was powered by the Americans with Disabilities Act for audio display to help the visually impaired.
But we're all perceptually impaired. That's how I I mean, if the simplest case is in the dark or if you're driving in a dense fog, but, there's certain things that we can't see. I mean, there's only a really narrow range of the spectrum, of the electromagnetic spectrum that we see as visible light.
I mean, there's some really great performances I've seen lately of people basically playing the Wi-Fi network in a concert hall.
Oh, cool. I mean, we all need sonification, is what
definitely.
I'm saying.
Like pouring a glass of water at night when you don't want to wake someone up. You have to listen. You don't overflow. Well, my associate here, Frank Dufour, was really bringing phenomenology into the sort of philosophical discourse about sonification, which is a really interesting sort of way of framing this, because it gets into the Bruno Latour's area where it's the phenomenon of the thing, which includes its sound, but doesn't necessarily make sound the only thing that it is.
Right. Well, I mean, what I liked about Latour, or what kind of struck me as like, oh yeah, was this idea of a cascade of mappings, that a scientific paper is never just like a single visualization or single mapping of the data. You just have this like almost relentless cascade of the data, first as text, and then it's a graph, and then it's a table, and then there are citations, and then it's almost like you need each one of those steps to just completely convince you of the argument
Well, I have
at
an
the end.
interesting phenomenon that I spotted, and maybe you have seen something and you can correct me here. But we did a thing with a Circos diagram. Tim Perkis wrote the initial JavaScript for it, and we made this thing where you were comparing fMRI data from young adults and old adults, or different ranges of age. And when you rolled over one arc of the Circos diagram, it made a sonification. And we had a pull-down menu that had 5 different types of sonification. So you hear the same data with 5 different sonification techniques. And I haven't seen that anywhere else. It seemed so simple, and we just did it sort of instinctually. And then I've been looking around for somebody else to do that same thing. It's sort of like what you said. The same set of data can sound completely different depending on the artist's approach or the craftsman's approach to what's going on, and sound designers.
No, that's a great idea to give that option. It's like almost like, you can look at it from the side or from the top.
I think that's got to become part of the new standard that I'm trying to advocate and propose. Anyway, so you're with that. I'm so happy to hear that, and I'd love to get your more input on how we should frame that, because I really respect your your whole point of view on this, since you've been ruminating on it now for 40 years, is it, or what is it?
Ruminating, chewing on it. Chewing on it.
25 years. That was a real interesting period, though, that early 90s. And it's even more interesting, as you pointed out in the talk, that our expectations were never met.
Well, yeah, I thought that by now it would be ubiquitous.
Yeah, all we got out of it was the mail sound on the Mac when you sent a mail.
Which is not bad.
When I'm talking about scale here, scale of sonification, there is the Geiger counter was made a long time ago. I did do an interesting thing. It hasn't become ubiquitous, but I took a Geiger counter and had it. Every time there was a click, it played a new chord from the progression of House of the Rising Sun. Like that. It actually was much more pleasant.
Yeah, maybe a Geiger counter shouldn't be pleasant, considering what it represents.
Okay, but there's a postdoc student in London who's working on making medical alerts be more musically framed, so that, like, as the things are beeping and plopping, it sounds okay when everything's okay, and then it gets more dissonant as as things get to be wrong.
Yeah, that medical alert thing came up at ICAD. It's quite a problem because it's so noisy in that environment, and there were physicians there, ER physicians, saying that they just block it out. Like, they're not even listening to it anymore, which is actually a dangerous situation.
It's the boy who cried wolf kind of deal, right? Where they hear this repeated thing, but there might be subtle changes that a really astute sonification could bring forward. And I think it has to have the musicality. Again, to get back to that thing you were saying about music, it has to have, I think, some element of musicality in a broader sense, in terms of music theory and that kind of thing, for it to really take on the sort of acceptability that. But maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, it could be we may have evolved. Well, certainly we've evolved to monitor the environment for danger using our ears, especially because we can hear even when we're asleep. We're still listening. I mean, because I've recently been working with some VR projects, and that it's really powerful for that, because if you're not looking at an object in virtual reality, it's kind of gone, but you can still hear it. If you can make it still be there with the sound, you can still hear it. So maybe we can utilize some of that, it's not necessarily musical. It may be more, it could be more noise or environmental sounds.
Or soundscapey or something.
Soundscapey, yeah.
Well, I like that blurry area too. I mean, one of interesting things about right now is the tools have gotten so good. And in no small part, what the listener might not know is one of the greatest tools ever developed is the Kima, I think. I mean, it's just a fantastic resource. I just saw Silvio Matusa's concert at Sinmat about a week on the 19th of November 2017, which was all Kima based and really fantastic. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
So you're still actively developing new ways of extending that environment.
Yes, that's what I was doing when. Yeah, well, it was a welcome
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the interesting things about the Kima is that there's a sort of small talk orientation to the way the structure of the overall system is. Is that I'm right about that? Right?
Yeah, it's written in small talk.
I know originally it was. I wasn't sure if that. Anyway, that's a really fascinating thing that found a niche. And what made me think of talking about the Kima is the place where I really heard about it a lot was when I was teaching sound design for films, and I started interviewing the people at Lucas and the different places around the Bay Area and even down in LA. And a lot of the top-notch guys were using Kima to create sound designs, especially the morphing things that you had early on and that kind of stuff.
Or the voice of Wally.
The voice of Wally. Yeah.
Ben Burt and Atwood.
So, have you had any of your Kima users delving into the area of scientific sonic representation at all?
Yes, I think I'm trying to think if there's anyone who's exclusively using it that way. But like you pointed out, almost all the people who are attracted to data sonification are also musicians. But I think that's training. I think that really is because we've been lucky enough to get training in attentive and analytical listening.
How many times have I done something where I can totally hear the two things are way different? And the persons I'm playing it for are going, I'm not. This sounds so similar. They seem like the same thing, And one is, the other one's, but they're both white noise that's filtered, so that becomes one semiotic unit,
I mean, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect that that you have to learn it. I mean, it's not.
That's a conclusion we've come to too.
Yeah. I mean, I was really surprised when I looked at the curriculum, like the Common Core curriculum in Illinois, how sophisticated some of the graphing and data collection that they expect, even from kindergarten through third grade. By third grade, they're already making line graphs.
Yeah.
So I think we forget that we're trained in that. We think it's natural, but I think we got a lot of training on that in elementary school.
Well, that was Mike Valora's point, that he's refocused the way his sonification research is. I guess the outcome that he wants is to do that kind of training more than anything, to familiarize people with thinking of sound in terms of information.
Even just the expectation that sound has meaningful information in it. Because so many people even listen to music that way, where they just kind of, just let it wash over. They're not listening even analytically to the music either.
Yeah.
And you miss something when you don't. I mean, of course, I love to get that ecstasy of listening to music also, but I think you can have many levels of listening to music, and you could hear the structure and get that auditory sublime at the same time. So I'm just thinking like that would help music as well if we could entice more people into learning this attentive listening.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things that has come across just recently is this idea that musicologists are starting, or at least a small group of them, are starting to think about using musicology in terms of timbre instead of the usual harmonic and rhythmic structural thing, which is like, what, But yeah. It's like,
wow.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
It really is a way to sort of level the playing field and get it out of the classical music place and go across the ethnography and across popular,
right.
Little high class, low class divide, all that.
And even, there is this kind of, you had mentioned sound designers earlier, and there's a nice kind of blurring going on in that as well between sometimes when you hear some sound designed for film, it really is crossing over into music, right? They're treating it very musically. And do you ever have this experience where if you go out with a microphone, if you go walking with a microphone, you listen differently than if you're just walking?
That's a fantastic way of doing something. I was in like a Colombian rainforest, and I had that same kind of epiphany, like, wow, hey, I'm experiencing this in a completely different way. Yeah. Well, shoot, we could go on for hours here, but I guess I better call it quits. But Carla Scaletti, this is just amazing to be able to talk to you.
Oh, this has been fun.
Sound and data.